Italy just made its biggest migration move yet, turning one controversial experiment into a template the rest of Europe is now studying. In November 2023, Rome struck a deal to build 2 migrant processing centers in Albania. A €650 million bet, run like a chain, testing a new store format abroad before selling the franchise. After 2025's border chaos at Ceuta, Brussels proposed its own EU-funded return hubs outside Europe, and Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands started asking for the blueprint. So how did Italy's riskiest migration idea become Europe's playbook? That question starts with a signature. On November 6th, 2023, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama signed a protocol no other EU country had tried, moving migrant processing outside the bloc entirely onto a partner nation's soil. Every EU state handles asylum inside its own borders. Italy chose to build outside it instead, betting that distance from Brussels courts and its own overloaded reception system would make the process faster. The problem behind it was a decade in the making. Every summer brought the same story in Italy. Overcrowded boats leaving Libya and Tunisia, overwhelmed reception islands like Lampedusa, and a revolving door of governments promising a fix that never arrived. On Lampedusa itself, home to roughly 6,000 residents, more than 10,000 migrants came ashore in a single 72-hour stretch in September 2023, swamping a hotspot built to hold around 400 people at a time. Meloni came to power promising to be different, and the Albania Protocol was her answer. Not another patrol boat or quota fight in Brussels, but an entirely new piece of infrastructure. That infrastructure existed because the old rules never worked in Italy's favor. Under the EU's asylum system, the country where someone first sets foot is usually stuck processing their claim, and Italy sits on the bloc's southern edge, the first port of call for boats crossing from North Africa. Years of spiking arrivals had overwhelmed Italian reception centers and courts long before Meloni took office, and no EU-wide fix had ever redistributed that burden in a way frontline states found fair. Frontex tallied roughly 157,000 sea arrivals to Italy in 2023, the highest count in nearly a decade, a number that fell to about 66,000 in 2024 after the Albania deal, and tighter departures from Tunisia took hold. Albania offered a way around that fight, and it was not a random choice. It sits a short crossing across the Adriatic from Italy's ports and has spent years courting Brussels as an official EU candidate country, eager to prove itself reliable. For Edi Rama, hosting Italy's centers was a way to bank goodwill with a bloc he wants to join. For Meloni, it was a way to move the most politically toxic part of migration policy somewhere voters wouldn't see it every night on the news. That distance from the nightly news suited Meloni's brand as much as the policy. Her government has spent years positioning itself as the model for Europe's harder line right, and the Albania deal became the flagship proof of that. Copied nowhere else yet, but watched everywhere, especially by governments under pressure from their own hard right challengers. Those challengers weren't the first to notice outsourcing migration control can work. Back in 2016, the EU paid Turkey billions of euros to hold back migrants before they reached Greek shores, a deal that reduced crossings but drew accusations of trading cash for closed eyes. What made Italy's Albania model different? It didn't just pay a neighbor to hold a line. It moved actual EU processing infrastructure onto foreign soil for the first time. That infrastructure took physical shape on Albania's coast. A disembarkation point at Shëngjin receives people directly off Italian and Albanian vessels. A processing and detention center inland at Gjadër is where the real work happens. Screening, documentation, and, in the original design, asylum decisions themselves. Under the protocol, Italian law and personnel run the inside of both sites, even though the ground beneath them is Albanian. Sovereign ground, foreign management, built for a serious operation, not a symbolic gesture. Room for up to 3,000 people held at any one time. A planned throughput of about 36,000 people a year. Rome priced the project at roughly 650 million euros over 5 years, spent up front, before a single case had been tested. This was infrastructure built to prove a concept, then scale it. Scaling it meant putting it to the test, and that test came almost a year later. On October 16, 2024, Italy sent its first transfer to Albania, 16 men rescued at sea, chosen to prove the system worked. The group crossed the Adriatic aboard the Italian Navy patrol vessel Libra. The ship, the Interior Ministry, then led by Matteo Piantadosi, had designated months earlier for the Bari to Shangjin run. It didn't survive the weekend. Within 48 hours, a tribunal in Rome ordered all of them returned to Italy. That reversal wasn't a technicality. The judges leaned on EU case law, governing which countries qualify as safe for return, and found Italy's list of safe countries of origin didn't meet the bar required. For the rest of 2024, the centers Rome had built for thousands sat largely empty. A facility designed to process 36,000 people a year had, in practice, processed almost none. The flagship had launched and immediately run aground. The mechanism that ran it aground matters beyond this one case. Under EU asylum rules, if a migrant comes from a country labeled safe, their claim can be fast-tracked and denied almost automatically on the assumption they weren't fleeing real danger. Italy had drawn up an expanded safe country list specifically to funnel more cases through Albania quickly. The Rome judges leaned on a Court of Justice of the European Union ruling issued that same October in a case testing the Czech Republic's own safe country list. The same legal bar Italy's list failed to clear. When judges ruled parts of that list didn't hold up, they weren't just blocking 16 men, they were blocking the legal shortcut the whole model depended on. A chain that opens a flagship store and watches it fail on day one doesn't abandon the concept. It redesigns the format and reopens. Italy did exactly that. In April 2025, the government issued a decree rewriting what the Albania centers were legally allowed to do. It didn't touch the buildings, staff, or money already spent. It touched the population being sent there. That population shrank on purpose. Gone was the plan to process asylum seekers whose claims hadn't been decided. The exact category a Rome court had just ruled couldn't legally be held there. What remained was narrower and harder to challenge. Only migrants who already held a final deportation order would be sent to Gjadër and Shengjin. Albania stopped being pitched as an offshore court that could decide asylum cases. It became, officially and only, a repatriation hub. That narrower hub was still settling in when a crisis on the opposite end of the continent handed Brussels its own reason to stop watching from the sidelines. Spain's Ceuta enclave, pressed against the Moroccan border, faced renewed strain through 2025 as arrival numbers spiked again with little warning. Not Ceuta's first emergency, but one that landed while Brussels was actively rethinking its options. Rethinking meant admitting a gap governments already suspected but hadn't said out loud. When a border spikes overnight, the EU has almost no fast legal mechanism for handling the surge. Ceuta became the political trigger cited again and again inside the Commission as the reason return policy needed one EU-wide answer, not 27 separate, improvised ones. A shared answer, in practice, does something specific. It holds people legally required to leave while their home countries are persuaded, sometimes slowly, to take them back. Readmission agreements with origin countries are notoriously hard to negotiate and slow to execute. And a hub outside EU territory lets Brussels keep people waiting without that wait counting against domestic reception capacity back home. Brussels turned that logic into law less than a year after Ceuta reignited the debate. On March 11, 2025, the European Commission unveiled a new EU return regulation, and for the first time wrote return hubs located outside its own territory into draft law. That single clause changed the category the Italy-Albania model belonged to. It stopped being one country's improvised workaround and became a template the entire Union was formally considering. Nobody in Brussels pretended the template came from nowhere. Migration Commissioner Magnus Brunner pointed directly at the Italy-Albania mechanism as the reference model the Commission drew from while drafting the regulation, a concept treated as uniquely aggressive barely 18 months earlier. Controversial enough to draw a court challenge within days of its first use, was now sitting inside the Commission's own legislative text, cited by name as precedent. That citation didn't stay theoretical for long. Once Brussels put its institutional weight behind the idea, capitals stopped keeping their distance. Germany, under Chancellor Friedrich Merz since May 2025, signaled openness to external processing arrangements of its own, a notable shift for a country that had spent years positioning itself as more cautious than Rome on migration. That caution didn't survive Germany's own politics. Merz took office after a bruising election in which migration policy dominated the campaign and a hard-right party kept eating into support for the mainstream parties. His predecessor had already tightened border checks under pressure. Merz inherited a country where doing nothing new on migration was no longer safe, and Italy's Albania model offered something concrete to point to. Merz's own interior minister, Alexander Dobrindt of the CSU, traveled to Rome in the summer of 2025 to review the Gjadër operation in person before drafting Germany's proposals. Austria and the Netherlands wanted something concrete too. Both governments began exploring versions of the same third country hub concept in parallel without waiting for the EU regulation to clear Parliament and Council. Each is reportedly scouting its own bilateral arrangement, the same way Italy went straight to Albania in 2023 rather than waiting for permission from Brussels. The blueprint spread faster than the law meant to formalize it. Rights groups have watched that spread with alarm, not admiration. UNHCR and other organizations have repeatedly warned that offshore facilities create real due process gaps. Migrants held far from the lawyers, interpreters, and support networks they'd have on EU soil, under oversight harder for journalists and independent monitors to reach. Access has been part of the fight from the start. Human rights observers and journalists have complained about limited, tightly managed access to the Gjadër site, which makes it harder to verify how people are actually treated inside. The same visibility problem, critics say, makes any offshore model harder to hold accountable than a facility inside the EU under EU courts' direct reach. Their strongest evidence isn't hypothetical. It's the October 2024 European Court of Justice ruling on safe country of origin designations, the exact ruling that forced Italy's first retreat within 48 hours of that transfer. But that's precisely the objection Italy's return-only rewrite was engineered to dodge. If nobody inside the center is still fighting an unresolved asylum claim, the safe country argument that sank version 1 has nothing left to attach to. The critics were right about the first design. They haven't yet found an opening in the second. A franchise that survives its first failed location doesn't stop being expensive to run. It just moves the argument from whether the concept works to what it costs everyone else to copy. Italy's roughly 650 million euros over 5 years stands as the cautionary price tag every other capital is now weighing before signing anything similar. Italy's own Corte dei Conti, the National Audit Court, calculated that with only a handful of cases processed in the center's first year, the effective cost per migrant handled at Gjadër and Shëngjin ran into 6 figures. A number opposition lawmakers repeated on the floor of Parliament. Critics reach for a specific ghost story. Britain's Rwanda scheme, an offshore asylum plan the UK government abandoned in 2024 after years of legal battles, hundreds of millions of pounds spent, and only a handful of people ever sent under it before an incoming government scrapped the whole program. The comparisons don't stop at a scrapped British program. Offshore processing has an older, more permanent precedent. Australia has run migrants through detention centers on Nauru and Manus Island since the early 2010s at enormous per-person cost. An arrangement still cited by both sides, supporters as proof deterrence works, critics as proof of how long these systems can trap people once the cameras move on. Cameras are exactly what the European Parliament keeps arguing about. The fight over the return regulation splits along familiar lines. Center-right and conservative blocs have broadly welcomed it as overdue enforcement, while Greens and the left argue the framework normalizes warehousing vulnerable people outside the reach of EU courts. Neither side has the votes to win outright, which is why the regulation is still being negotiated rather than passed. What they're really negotiating over isn't any single center. It's whether facilities like these actually deter people from attempting the crossing, or just relocate the same population to a different building without changing anyone's calculation back home. Neither side has clean data to settle that, which is why both keep pointing to the same handful of case studies. Success itself is hard to define here. Fewer irregular crossings would be the headline metric politicians reach for, But that number is notoriously hard to attribute to any single policy, since crossings rise and fall with conflict, smuggling routes and weather long before any hub opens its doors. Italy's own numbers, at least, aren't ambiguous. The centers at Gjadër and Shëngjin were built to run 36,000 people a year through the system. Through 2024, under the original design, they processed a fraction of that. Buildings sized for a crowd that never showed up under the asylum processing model courts had blocked. Independent monitors have pointed at that gap, asking whether a mechanism this expensive can deliver the volume it was sold on. Part of that shortfall traces back to something outside Italy's control. Some origin countries refuse to accept certain nationals back at all, or drag negotiations out for months, leaving a return hub holding people who are legally removable but have nowhere confirmed to send them. That gap between a deportation order on paper and a deportation flight that actually happens is a problem no facility, however well built, can solve alone. Behind every one of those numbers sits an individual case. Someone who crossed the Mediterranean once, ended up in a legal holding pattern on foreign soil, and is now waiting on a system two governments are still redesigning around them. That's the cost of running policy as a pilot program. The people caught inside don't get to wait for the final version. The final version, in the franchise sense, is the one running in Albania now. The redesigned branch, not the failed opening pitch. Heading toward 2026, Gjadër and Shëngjin operate under that narrower, return-only mandate set in April 2025, built to survive a courtroom rather than impress a press conference. Brussels' own version isn't there yet. The EU return regulation still needs approval from both the European Parliament and the Council before it becomes binding law, a process still grinding through committee rooms and member state objections as 2025 closes out. The debate keeps turning up older ghosts, too. Denmark passed a law back in 2021 that would have allowed asylum processing outside the EU, then quietly shelved it before a single center opened. Italy isn't the first country to reach for this idea, just the first to make it stick past the first legal challenge. What separates this moment from Denmark's shelved attempt is scale. If the return regulation passes, it won't be a one-off arrangement between two governments. It will be the first EU-level legal basis for processing returns on territory outside the Union's own borders, a shared foundation rather than a single country's improvisation. That shared foundation is designed to be reused. Any member state will be able to run its own version through a bilateral deal with a third country, using Brussels law as the legal cover Italy had to invent alone in 2023. Where Rome once had to write its own protocol from scratch and defend it in court alone, the next country in line gets to point at an EU regulation instead. That's the part Italy has already banked, whatever happens in the courts from here. What started in November 2023 as one government's contested, go-it-alone pilot is now written into the European Union's own draft legislation. Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands are openly discussing versions of the same mechanism as of 2025, not as a favor to Rome, but because the idea has quietly stopped sounding radical. There's a tension underneath that shift the regulation won't resolve. The EU built its asylum system around the idea that claims get decided inside its own legal space, with its own courts as the backstop. Every version of a return hub, however narrowly defined, tests how far that principle can bend before it breaks. And Italy has now run that experiment twice, adjusting its answer once already. Italy's EXPERIMENT ISBECOMING EUROPE's Bielwiprant. A courtroom stopped the first version in 48 hours. A redesign, a border crisis at Ceuta, and a commissioner's public endorsement got the second version written into EU law within about 18 months. The chain tested its new store format in Albania, absorbed the losses at its first location, and is now fielding requests to sell the franchise to Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands. Whether that franchise turns out to be a humane fix for an overloaded asylum system, or just a more expensive way to move the same problem somewhere with fewer cameras watching, is still an open argument, and probably will be for years. Where do you land on that one? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see where Europe's next move is.